The Beverly Wilshire Hotel stood like a sentinel in the heart of Beverly Hills, its grand ballroom transformed into an arena where Hollywood's old guard and new blood circled each other with practiced indifference. Crystal chandeliers cast intricate shadows across the marble floors, their light catching on the rim of expensive champagne flutes and the careful smiles of those who wielded influence like a weapon. Tonight's Veterans Mental Health Gala was supposed to be about service and sacrifice. But in Hollywood, every event was a stage, and everyone was performing. Everyone except Clint Eastwood. The event had drawn the usual suspects. Studio executives in tailored suits worth more than most people's monthly salary, rising stars carefully positioned by their publicists to be accidentally photographed with industry veterans, and social media influencers who had somehow convinced the world that their opinions on cinema mattered. The air was thick with expensive perfume, carefully crafted laugh lines, and the unmistakable scent of ambition. In one corner, a group of producers discussed their latest projects in hushed tones, their conversations punctuated by subtle glances at their phones, always checking, always connected to the next big thing. Near the entrance, a cluster of younger actors posed for photos, their smiles practiced and perfect, their eyes constantly scanning the room for more important people to impress. The Veterans Mental Health Initiative that had brought them all together seemed almost forgotten amid the networking and posturing. The legendary actor's arrival caused a ripple through the crowd, though not in the way modern celebrities did. There was no fanfare, no attention-seeking entrance, just the quiet confidence of a man who had spent decades proving himself in an industry that devoured the weak. At 94, Clint Eastwood moved with the deliberate grace of someone who had earned every step, his weathered face carrying the kind of gravitas that made even the most self-assured executives lower their voices in deference. His presence was like a gravitational force, subtle but undeniable. People noticed him not because he demanded attention, but because he commanded respect. His well-fitted black suit wasn't from this season's designer collection, but it carried the kind of classic elegance that never went out of style. His eyes, still sharp and observant, took in the room with the practiced ease of someone who had seen Hollywood evolve from the golden age through the digital revolution. Brandon Matthews, a rising star in the world of digital journalism, watched from across the room, his fingers drumming against the stem of his untouched wineglass. He had made his name writing scathing takedowns of Hollywood's old guard, positioning himself as the voice of a generation tired of outdated ideologies. His articles, dripping with calculated contempt for what he called dinosaur thinking, had earned him a substantial following and a reputation for fearlessness. But tonight, he wasn't after just any target. He was after the biggest one of all. The young journalist's rise to prominence had been meteoric, fueled by a perfect storm of social media savvy and controversial opinions. His piece, The Death of the American Hero, Why We Need to Kill Our Cowboys, had gone viral last month, earning him both death threats and speaking engagements. His Twitter following had doubled, and 3 major publications had reached out for column opportunities. But Matthews knew that in the age of digital media, you were only as relevant as your last viral moment. He adjusted his designer tie, a gift from his last speaking engagement about dismantling toxic masculinity in cinema. His phone was already recording in his pocket, ready to capture what he imagined would be his crowning achievement: the public dismantling of Clint Eastwood's legacy. What Matthews didn't realize was that he was about to learn a lesson about the difference between trending and timeless, between volume and value. Around the room, conversations ebbed and flowed like tides. A veteran actress, her face showing the subtle signs of fighting time with expensive procedures, held court near the bar, regaling younger performers with sanitized versions of old Hollywood stories. Studio executives huddled in corners, their conversations a mix of budget discussions and careful character assassinations. The jazz quartet in the corner played soft renditions of classic songs, their music a gentle reminder of an era when entertainment didn't need to shock to be meaningful. The room seemed to pulse with anticipation as Matthews began his approach. Several veteran actors and directors who knew both Eastwood's reputation and the young journalist's work exchanged knowing glances. They had seen this scene play out before. Ambitious young upstarts thinking they could make their name by taking down a legend. But Clint Eastwood wasn't just any legend. He was a man who had survived 6 decades in an industry that measured careers in months. Near the bar, Eastwood was engaged in conversation with a former Marine, listening intently as the veteran shared stories from his tours in Afghanistan. The actor's focus was complete, his famous squint softening as he absorbed every word. This was the real Clint Eastwood, not the caricature that critics tried to paint, but a man who had always understood that true strength lay in listening, not just speaking. Matthews positioned himself perfectly, making sure his approach would be captured by several nearby phones. He had scripted this confrontation in his head a dozen times, each version ending with him emerging victorious over what he saw as a symbol of everything wrong with old Hollywood. The irony that he was about to ambush a man at a charity event for veterans seemed lost on him, but then again, in the age of viral moments, context was often the first casualty. As the young journalist closed the final few steps between himself and his target, the ambient chatter in the room seemed to dim. Even the jazz quartet in the corner appeared to play more softly, as if the very atmosphere was preparing itself for what was about to unfold. Matthews cleared his throat, his confident smile masking a nervousness he wouldn't admit to himself. He was about to learn why some legends aren't just stories, they're warnings. "Mr. Eastwood," Matthews called out, his voice carrying just enough to draw attention without seeming obvious about it. "Brandon Matthews from Digital Culture Daily. Mind if I ask you a few questions about the state of modern Hollywood?" The room's atmosphere shifted subtly, like the moment before a storm. Those nearest to the impending confrontation found reasons to linger, their conversations dying mid-sentence as they positioned themselves to witness what promised to be either a spectacular takedown or a magnificent failure. The veteran Eastwood had been speaking with took a diplomatic step back, though his expression suggested he'd seen enough real battles to know one was brewing. Eastwood turned slowly, his eyes carrying the weight of decades spent watching people reveal their true intentions. He didn't respond immediately, a technique he had mastered long before Matthews was born, the power of silence in a world that couldn't stop talking. The pause stretched long enough to make lesser men uncomfortable, but Matthews held his ground, mistaking the silence for uncertainty rather than the calculated assessment it was. A nearby waiter, sensing the tension, slowed his circuit of the room, his tray of champagne flutes temporarily forgotten. The soft clicks of phone cameras being activated provided a subtle percussion to the jazz quartet's muted performance. Everyone in the vicinity knew they were about to witness something, they just weren't sure what. "It won't take long," Matthews added, his smile growing sharper, more predatory. "I just wanted to get your thoughts on whether there's still room in Hollywood for, well, certain perspectives. Your generation's approach to storytelling, for instance." He emphasized the words "your generation" with the subtle condescension of someone who believed history began with their own awareness of it. The subtle emphasis hung in the air like smoke, acrid and intentional. Around them, conversations quieted as people pretended not to listen while hanging on every word. A few phones were discreetly raised, their cameras capturing what everyone assumed would be another viral moment in the making. The tension in the room was palpable, electric with anticipation. Eastwood took a slow sip of his whiskey, the ice cubes clinking against the glass in the near silence that had fallen over their immediate vicinity. He set the glass down with deliberate care, the movement so precise it seemed choreographed. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the kind of authority that comes from experience rather than volume. "Son," he said, each word measured and deliberate, "I've been in this business longer than you've been alive. What exactly are you trying to say?" The question wasn't just a question, it was a challenge, an invitation for Matthews to show his hand. The young journalist's smile flickered but didn't fade, like a faulty neon sign determined to keep burning. This was his moment, his chance to show his followers how fearless he was, how he could stand toe-to-toe with one of Hollywood's most iconic figures and emerge victorious. "Well, Mr. Eastwood," Matthews began, his voice taking on the practiced tone of someone delivering a prepared speech, "some would argue that your type of filmmaking, the masculine archetypes, the conservative undertones, is outdated, that it's time for fresh voices, new perspectives. Don't you think it's time to step aside and let progress happen?" The words fell into the space between them like stones into still water, creating ripples of reaction throughout the gathered crowd. Someone near the bar inhaled sharply. A veteran actress shook her head slightly, recognizing the familiar dance of generational conflict that had played out countless times in Hollywood's history. But this wasn't just any conflict. This was Clint Eastwood, a man who had faced down critics and challengers for longer than most people in the room had been alive. Matthews continued, gaining momentum from the attention he could feel focused on him. Your films, while historically significant, represent a worldview that many find problematic in today's social climate. The lone wolf hero, the might makes right mentality, these are narratives we're trying to move past. Don't you think it's time for Hollywood to evolve beyond these dated perspectives? The question hung in the air like a thrown gauntlet, a challenge that seemed to demand a response. The room held its collective breath, waiting to see how the legendary actor would react to this direct challenge to his legacy. Some expected anger, others anticipated defensiveness, but none of them, least of all Matthews, were prepared for what came next. The room held its breath, waiting for the explosion that never came. Instead, Clint Eastwood did something far more devastating. He laughed, not mockingly, but with the genuine amusement of someone who had seen this playbook too many times to count. The sound cut through the tension like a knife, unexpected and disarming. Progress, Eastwood repeated, rolling the word around like he was tasting it, his voice carrying the weight of decades of experience. You know what real progress is, kid? It's not about tearing down what came before. It's about building something better. So tell me, he leaned forward slightly, his presence filling the space between them. What have you built? The question landed with the precision of a sniper's bullet. Matthews blinked, his carefully prepared script suddenly useless in the face of such direct inquiry. The confidence that had carried him across the room seemed to evaporate under Eastwood's steady gaze. I give voice to a new generation, he stammered, but the words sounded hollow even to his own ears, echoing emptily in the space that had formed around them. A voice saying what? Eastwood pressed, his tone remaining measured but carrying an intensity that made Matthews take an unconscious step back. That everything old is bad? That wisdom expires? Let me tell you something about Hollywood, son. I've been written off more times than you've had viral tweets. But I'm still here, still making films, still telling stories that matter. Why? Because I learned something you haven't figured out yet. It's not about being loud, it's about being worth listening to. The crowd around them had grown, drawn by the quiet intensity of the exchange. Veterans who had been quietly observing from the sidelines now stood straighter, recognizing in Eastwood's words the kind of leadership they understood. Young actors and executives who had been surreptitiously recording the confrontation on their phones slowly lowered their devices, suddenly conscious of their own role in the spectacle. Matthews could feel his control of the situation slipping away, but pride wouldn't let him retreat. The world is changing, he insisted, his voice rising slightly, betraying his frustration. Your kind of stories don't resonate anymore. The audiences want different heroes, different narratives. They want stories that reflect modern values and perspectives. Eastwood's response was like a masterclass in the power of understatement. My kind of stories? He asked, eyebrow raised. You mean stories about honor? About standing up for what's right? About sacrifice and redemption? Tell me which part of that doesn't resonate. He paused, letting the words sink in before continuing. You know what your problem is, son? You're so busy trying to be revolutionary that you've forgotten what a revolution is actually for. The veteran actor's words carried the weight of authenticity that no amount of social media influence could match. He gestured to the room around them, to the veterans' mental health initiative banners that hung on the walls. You want to talk about outdated? Let's talk about thinking you can build something meaningful by tearing others down. That's the oldest trick in the book, and it's never worked, not once. A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. Matthews felt the ground shifting beneath his feet, his carefully constructed narrative crumbling in real time. He had come expecting to expose what he saw as outdated thinking, but instead found himself exposed, revealed as someone more interested in creating controversy than understanding. But times have changed, Matthews attempted one last defense. though his voice had lost its earlier certainty. The industry needs to adapt to new sensibilities, new perspectives. Times always change, Eastwood cut him off, his voice carrying the calm authority of someone who had witnessed those changes firsthand. But principles, honor, courage, the willingness to stand up for what's right, those things don't have an expiration date. You want to talk about progress? Show me what you're progressing toward, not just what you're running from. The silence that followed was deafening. Matthews opened and closed his mouth several times, but no words came out. He had come armed with accusations but found himself defenseless against wisdom. Eastwood wasn't playing the game Matthews had expected. He wasn't angry, wasn't defensive, wasn't providing any of the sound bites the young journalist had hoped to capture. Instead, he was offering something far more valuable, a lesson in humility. "Let me give you some free advice," Eastwood continued, his voice carrying to every corner of the now silent room. "Success in this town, real success, not just trending topics, comes from creating, not destroying. I've made over 60 films, directed 30, and you know what? Some worked, some didn't. But each one was an attempt to tell a story that meant something. What's your story?" The question hung in the air like a mirror, reflecting back not just at Matthews, but at everyone in the room. The young journalist felt the heat rising in his face as he realized the trap he had walked into. His phone, still recording in his pocket, now felt like a dead weight, capturing not his triumph, but his education. Around them, the crowd had grown larger, drawn by the quiet intensity of the exchange. Industry veterans nodded in silent agreement with Eastwood's words, while younger attendees shifted uncomfortably, perhaps seeing reflections of their own ambitions in Matthew's humiliation. The jazz quartet had stopped playing entirely, as if providing a moment of silence for the death of arrogance. I should go," Matthews managed, his carefully cultivated image of fearless truth-teller crumbling under the weight of authentic experience. The phones recording the exchange now felt like accusers rather than allies, their lenses capturing not the takedown of an outdated icon, but the education of a modern pretender. As he turned to leave, Eastwood's voice followed him, carrying the kind of wisdom that only comes from decades of experience. "Hey, kid," the legendary actor called out, causing Matthews to pause mid-retreat. "When you're ready to make something instead of just criticizing what others have made, come find me. I'll be happy to talk then." The young journalist's departure was swift, leaving behind a room full of people who had just witnessed not just a confrontation, but a lesson in the difference between influence and impact. As conversation slowly resumed, someone near the bar whistled low. "Brutal," they murmured, shaking their head in amazement. Eastwood shook his head, turning back to his conversation with the veteran. "Not brutal," he corrected, taking another sip of his whiskey. "Necessary. Sometimes the kindest thing you can do for someone is let them learn their limitations." He paused, a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Besides, he'll either learn from this and become better, or he won't. Either way, that's his story to write." As the night continued, the story of the exchange spread through the room like wildfire, then through Hollywood, and finally through social media. Though not in the way Matthews had intended. It became a reminder that in an age of instant opinions and quick takedowns, there was still value in experience, in wisdom, and in the kind of strength that doesn't need to shout to be heard. The Beverly Wilshire's ballroom returned to its usual rhythm of deals and discussions, but something had changed. A lesson had been taught about the difference